One reason I decided to create what I call the sexual polarity quadrant is because I noticed that people often conflate what it means to be masculine and what it means to be dominant, right? So this is going to be a video breaking down some of my sexual polarity quadrant. I haven't heard anyone else speak of this, so this is a concept that even if someone has spoken of it before, I haven't heard it, right? So there is a stark contrast between what it means to be masculine and what it means to be dominant. Now, I'll say this right here, right? Within the sexual polarity quadrant, there are abundance mindsets, and then there are survival modes, right? Abundance mindsets and survival modes, right? So one thing to understand is that femininity is something that corrupts dominance, right? Now, there may be times where that comes in handy, maybe times where that's useful, right? But at the same time, it's something that corrupts dominance. And masculinity is something that stifles submissiveness. It stifles it, right? Now, there's reasons for all of these different things when I'm talking about the sexual polarity quadrant, right? See, masculinity stifles submissiveness because when you're a masculine individual, oftentimes you have to logically think about the different things that are transpiring. You have to have more of a holistic mindset about what you're doing. Now, within that holistic mindset, you come to a place of knowing who you are, right? Or at least of being solid on what it is that you're trying to do, right? You have to be solid on what it is that you're trying to do. That's what it means to be masculine, right? But that masculine place comes from that logical, more dry, more rigid perspective. Now, you can be masculine without being dominant, right? The way to be masculine without being dominant is to be the masculine submissive. The masculine submissive is the most natural, and I'm not going to say natural as far as the most abundant aspect of life, but it's the most common form and the most common role within the sexual polarity quadrant, right? If you meet an individual, the first thing that comes to your mind when you meet someone shouldn't be to dominate them, right? You're just meeting a person, and this is not a romantic context. This isn't a sexual context. This is from a perspective of two people who are equal in inherent and intrinsic value, right? Just inherent intrinsic value. You're a human. You're worthy of respect. So from that platform of being worthy of respect, an individual takes the masculine submissive role. Now, part of the reason you take this masculine submissive role is because of the social boundaries and rules that come with the way that you interact with someone. So that means that there's a certain social programming, a certain social conditioning, and a certain way of socially interacting with the individual that is legal, right? That respects boundaries and that doesn't seek to exert itself over another person. That's the masculine submissive. Sometimes this can be just what men have with one another when you understand that there is always an implied threat of violence when it comes to conversations between a man and a man, right? Like two men are face to face, typically there is an implied threat of violence. So unless you're willing to cross that line of that implied threat of violence, you don't seek to dominate another man. Because if you respect that man, you understand what can transpire, right? If push comes to shove. And oftentimes this shit is not fucking necessary. You get what I'm saying? It's just not. So that's where the masculine submissive comes into play. Another area where the masculine submissive comes into play is just the discipline of doing something that you don't fucking feel like doing for the sake of financial gain, for the sake of stability, for the sake of security, right? That's an aspect of masculine submissive. So, like, let's say you are a logical thinking man. If you are a logical thinking man, right, and the police come around, right, you're typically going to take a masculine submissive stance, right? Because to try to take a dominant stance towards the police, especially as a black man, because I'm a black man, right, is something that can cost you your life, right? Another thing is this, a masculine submissive stance. Let's say you are working in a job, but that job is not your platform. It is not your business, right? And because it's not your business, you have to submit yourself and cooperate with your supervisor in order to get the resources that you desire, right? Now, that may not be what you want to do with your time. That may not be what you want to do with your energy. That may not be what you want to do with your body from an intrinsic desired place. But you are receiving something that isn't intrinsic, right? From your ability to not exert yourself to take a dominant position within that role that you're playing. So that's the masculine submissive. So a person can be masculine without being dominant. That's a very logical perspective to take. There's nothing wrong with it. I just have an issue with it when it comes to romantic relationships, because oftentimes you're going to attract the opposite energy of what you're putting out. When I talk about the sexual polarity quadrant, it's not just to say that a man should be masculine and a woman should be feminine. There are some women who can be masculine who like a feminine man. But one thing we do have to stay conscious of is the core polarity, right? There's something called a core polarity, right? So a person can be in a survival mode, and in that place of survival, they are able to repress their dominance or repress their masculinity or repress their femininity or repress their submissiveness, but that's not truly who they are at the core of their being. So that means that if their cup gets filled, right, then who they are naturally is going to begin to come out, right? So another aspect of it is when it comes to interpersonal relationships, especially romantic and or sexual relationships, that is where the aspect of an individual being dominant is something that is more so necessary than when you're talking about two individuals who have no desire or expectation of dealing with each other on a deep, profound sexual or interpersonal level like that, or there is no context of leadership. It's not necessary, right? It's just not necessary. But in situations where those things are taking place, it can be a lot more necessary, or at least a lot more natural, right? Now, there are a lot of men who actually are masculine, right? But they've spent so much time repressing the natural dominance that is within themselves that they get upset, right? They get upset at the fact that a woman's biological drives and imperatives is going to be to lean towards and to yield herself towards the dominant force or power within her vicinity, right? Now, this power can be in several different forms, right? Sometimes it might be big bank, take little bank. Sometimes it might be who she desires to have sex with the most. Sometimes it's the person who has the best social skills and ability to interact. They're dominant within their environment. Sometimes it is a person who's very intellectually dominant. Sometimes it's whoever's the most physically dominant, right? Like if we're talking about hunter-gatherer type of shit, then typically the man who's the most physically dominant is going to have a certain position of dominance, right? Because of his physical strength, right? But sometimes that physical strength can get things added to it that can kind of replace just the pure and raw physicality. So let's say it's an individual who has the ability to know how to fight, right? Like I'm 5'9", 5'10", and 190 pounds, right? But I've knocked out men who were, 6'4 plus, 6'1", 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", who, had a good bit of weight on me, right? Because I'm Coach Brody. I was an amateur boxer. People in my town, and that's not my only town, because really I was born in Indianapolis, right? I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. And, I spent some time in Atlanta, and I was pretty much raised in like 5 different states. But the place where I really set a lot of my roots down, as far as my childhood, was in Florence, South Carolina. Florence, South Carolina is where I fought out of, right? That's where my father's from, Florence, South Carolina, right? And anytime I go to a football game or something like that when I'm in town, most of the time when people remember me and they walk up to me, it's because they remember me as the boxing guy. They remember me as the boxing guy. So there's a period of time in my gym when I was an amateur where I was the best boxer in my gym, although we had professional boxers in our gym, right? So I would spar with pretty much whoever would come in there, right? So although my stature didn't convey dominance, my skill, my tenacity, my mind, and just my ability to hit hard and my ability to have the mindset to exploit weaknesses, right? My mentality, right? Those were things that gave me the ability to have dominance in my environment, right? That's a factor of dominance. But what we have to understand is that just because something is dominant doesn't mean that it's masculine, right? So let's say that, when we're talking about internalized definitions of masculinity, that's a little bit different, right? Because masculinity and femininity, they are, crucial aspects, but they are somewhat subjective, when it comes to the way people internally define these things. But dominance is a little bit more primordial. It's a little bit more primal. It's a little bit more biological. It's a little bit more, it is what it is when it comes to dominance, right? Now, the way that I define dominant when it comes to sexual relationships or romantic relationships in general is to be dominant means that you're the primary giver of pleasure and the primary receiver of control. Now, that's not always a matter of how many sex acts that you act on the person versus how many they do on you. It doesn't always mean that. It's just the pleasure and the gratification that is taken out of that particular thing. It's just when you give up control and allow a person to take you further than you could take yourself, then you are in a position of being submissive within that moment. Now, some people can compartmentalize that into different aspects. Like for me personally, sometimes I get personal information. For me, I like to compartmentalize certain aspects of my submissive sexual ego into receiving oral sex. Now, I can use my dominant ego if I'm throat training a woman. But unless a woman is adequately throat trained, and I've throat trained her myself to where she can handle me dominating her mouth, dominating her throat, the femininity has lubricated her for dominance, lubricated her submissiveness. So that means her throat is activated and trained and ready to be dominated, to where that's something that's pleasurable and something that she enjoys and takes gratification from her ability to receive it, and takes an ego gratification from her ability to receive it within her submissive ego. Then I also like if a woman can get into her dominant ego when she's performing oral sex on me. And when she gets into her dominant ego when she's performing oral sex on me, I could get into my submissive ego and allow her to be in a position of power and control and to stroke her own ego through the way that she can satisfy me with her skills with the oral sex. So oftentimes that may look more like a woman hitting me with the double fist, yuck, yuck, twisty fist, twisted, slurp it, bop it, 5,000, right? That's what that is. And I teach both. So I teach a woman to do that, to the things that's necessary to dominate me the way I like to be dominated when it comes to receiving oral sex. And if it's a situation where she's ready to, and I'm throat training that particular woman, then we'll tap more into the submissive sexual ego for her, and I'll stay in my dominant sexual ego. But there is a difference between masculinity and dominance. When you think about masculinity, think about the immovable object, right? And when you think dominance, think about the unstoppable force, right? So masculinity is the immovable object, and dominance is the unstoppable force. Now, one thing to understand when I'm defining dominance, or when I'm defining masculinity versus femininity, is masculinity is to be more focused on how you're doing something, right? Or even sometimes why you're doing something, to be more focused on the path that you take, right? And staying firmly within who it is that you believe you are while you're going through that path, right? That's more important than who it is that you are walking on that path with. Those are the boundaries of being masculine, right? And to be feminine is to be more concerned with the person or the outcome, right, than it is to be concerned with staying true to the way that you go into the situation, or to how you believe you will interact before you deal with the person, right? This is very important to understand, right? So there's nothing inherently good or bad about masculinity or femininity. It just is what it is, right? So to be masculine is like, let's say I walk up to a woman and I'm talking to her, and I could take a masculine submissive or a masculine dominant approach, right? Now, to take a masculine dominant approach is for me to know what my objective is and to be direct with her about my objective, right? That's what it means for me to take a masculine dominant approach, is to be direct with her about my objective, right? And that may look like me giving her my number, me instructing her on what to do and me telling her what it is that I want to do, or me even talking to her in a way to where she's asking me what I want to do to her, and then she's pretty much asking me to give her consent. She's asking me for permission before I put it in, right? See, that's a masculine dominant approach, is you're being upfront, right? Because just like I said, femininity is something that corrupts dominance. See, femininity corrupts dominance in the way that you become malleable about the way in which you desire to dominate an individual, right? And by becoming malleable in the way, and fluid in the way that you seek to dominate an individual, it puts you in a position where you get really into the thrill, the thrill of the challenge, right? And this is something that can go good. This is something that can go bad. So that means that you encounter the individual, and instead of knowing the way that you want to interact with them, you're going to interact with them and then find whatever works. And there are levels of feminine dominance. There are levels to which certain boundaries somebody may not cross. So for somebody may go as far as lying. Sometimes it may be lies of omission. Sometimes it's lies of commission. Sometimes an individual will love bomb someone. Sometimes an individual will use certain manipulative mind games. And I'm not 100% against mind games, right? Because honestly, I feel like if you're direct with the person in a way where you understand their psychology and understand how to use psychology to reinforce your honesty, that's still a certain level of a mind game, right? Because it's not just cold, cut, and dry. If you're persuasive, right? Persuasion is influence. In this day and age, influence, it has no delineation between influence and manipulation, because what people really adhere to is the idea of, especially a woman being masculine, knowing what she wants before she meets the individual and then sticking to that after she meets the individual. But what it means to be feminine is you meet an individual and then you're malleable to the way that things have to be. Right? So masculinity stifles submissiveness. Now, what does that mean when I say that masculinity stifles submissiveness? This can work in a variety of ways. So like, let's say you meet a woman, right? And you say, okay, cool. In your mind, before you meet the woman, you say, okay, cool. I'm giving her 3 dates. I'm going to spend some money on her, emotional validation, social validation, and financial investment, right? So you're going to take her out on maybe 3 dates. That's your 3-date rule. And if you don't fuck by the 3rd date, then you're going to go ahead and get rid of the woman, right? Now, the thing about that is we have to keep this in mind as well when it comes to the masculine submissive. If you are an individual who is going by the general, typical way that dating works, as in you're going by the social conditioning, it's a certain unspoken rule, then that could still be seen as masculine, although you aren't being very upfront and straightforward about exactly what you want, because the woman knows you want to fuck when you approach her, right? She knows you want to fuck, right? So by offering the transaction that usually takes place before sex, then you're putting your money in, you're putting your time in, you're putting your energy in, you're putting the emotional, social, and financial investment in, and in exchange for that investment, you want to receive sexual access to the woman. Now understand this, right? When you are taking that masculine submissive role, you're stifled in your ability to be submissive. What does that mean? That means that you would meet up to her standards, right? Of, if you're talking to her, you would meet up to her standards about what it would take for you to get what you want, but you'd be so focused on enjoying her company, separate from the idea of getting anything out of it. You'd be too focused on that to worry about exactly how much you were investing before you have sex with the woman. See, that's the feminine submissive approach as a man. So you may say, yeah, I'd like some pussy, but I just really like her personality. I think she's just beautiful. I like talking to her. I like spending time with her. When I'm around her, it's just a vibe. This non-sexual access that I'm giving this woman, it really feels like non-sexual access that she's giving me. So that's a feminine submissive approach, right? Now, we also have to understand what survival mode submissiveness is, right? So that's like if you're very green and you're just overly excited about that experience, then you may be in a position where you try to stay in the feminine submissive. But if you're not truly in an abundance mindset, then you're going to run out of steam. Your cup's going to get low. Then you're going to pretty much bait and switch from trying to take a feminine submissive approach when you're not in abundance, right? You have to understand that. But that's a real thing that can occur, right? It's where you're so focused on the non-sexual interaction that you both intrinsically enjoy the non-sexual interaction, right? And then sex isn't a guarantee, but if you meet up to her standards, then you can have sex with her later. And that's kind of like if you say a woman says she only wants to have sex with a man if she's in a long-term relationship, right? Or if she is married to the man, right? And that would be an aspect of the feminine submissive, right? Especially if you know she's fucking other guys at the same time. That would be taking a feminine submissive approach as a man. And like I said, this is somewhat based on the internalized definitions of masculinity, the internalized definitions of femininity. There are going to be exceptions to all of these things. There's going to be women who just want dick. There's going to be men who just want company and time and conversation. But I'm talking about the average man whose ego is going to be more stroked by fucking a woman than his ego is going to be stroked by just having a conversation with a woman. Because typically, sex is something that's going to fill most men's cup, more so based off of our biological imperatives as well as our social programming. And non-sexual investment is going to stroke a woman's ego more. It's going to pour more into her cup. It's going to stroke her dominant her dominant ego more than just fucking some random guy. Right? So what happens is this: when you're taking a masculine dominant approach, you are stretching a woman, right? But you're stretching her based off of your ability to present what you want to do dominantly as something that she should enjoy, which is stretching her, which is pretty much pouring out of her cup. But the intrinsic pleasure that she's getting is worth the control that she's giving up based off of how she would previously view the interaction that she would like to have before you communicate with her, right? This is what I'm saying right here, right? It's the stretching process. Now, for the masculine dominant man who may be upfront and honest about his sexual intentions, and there may be men who are upfront and honest about the full package, but for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of just leading with the full package unless your vetting system, it allots for it. And part of the reason I'm not the biggest fan of leading with the full package is because, let's say, a woman has sex with you, not because she just sexually desires you, but because you tell her that you're looking to get married. And then you realize that there's something non-sexually about her or something just sexually about her that turns you off. And then now you've promised or given her the expectation that something deeper would come out of it. But then after you give her the expectation that something would deeper come out of it, you aren't willing to continue to put work into it afterwards and to improve the situation. So you pretty much and effectively, in her mind, give off the impression that you are a feminine dominant man who is lying about what his intentions are. Right? Like, there aren't a lot of things that I would ever really disagree with Alan Roger Curry on, and I'm not even sure if this is a disagreement. This is something that I when I see that whole idea of just being 100% upfront about wanting to get married with a woman, I'm like, I don't know. It's just like, how much of that desire to engage with that man is based on the fact that she wants a relationship, and how much of that desire to engage sexually is based off of the fact that she is actually sexually attracted to him. And then also, how much, what are the chances that that situation is actually going to pan out in marriage in a lot of instances, right? Now, I do see that there are some men who can have so much experience that they can kind of identify the traits that they would view as marriage material relatively quickly. And then there also may be some instances where the man will be willing to divvy off on sex and make the woman wait for sex, right? And that's still a masculine dominant stance, right? When you make the woman wait and work for sex through her ability to show herself as non-sexually valuable to you. So that's still a masculine dominant stance to do that. See, there's a difference between qualifying yourself for the woman in the feminine submissive role and the woman qualifying herself for you, and it's still being primarily a non-sexual engagement and interaction, right? So the sexual polarity quadrant, it flows in a lot of different manners like that. But when we see like the men who are like act like liars, they just lie to women, men who sexually assault women, men who coerce women, men who just, men, there's a lot of men who do a lot of different things that is very feminine dominant. And a lot of women do the same things. So it's like, if you're in a masculine dominant stance and a woman is not picking up what you're putting down, you walk the fuck away, right? You might be willing to have a little conversation, which is, it shows a certain level of putting your masculinity ahead of your dominance by being willing to communicate if she's not receptive to your dominance, right? But that's going from the masculine dominant to the masculine submissive for a moment in time, right? But if you stay in the masculine dominant stance, if she isn't picking up what you're putting down, you walk away. But there's also some men who put their dominance ahead of their masculinity. So that means that you can be very upfront with the woman, right? Very upfront. But if that woman then bait and switches on you, then it becomes pretty much an open door to manipulate the woman or to abuse the woman or do a variety of things because you were upfront. But now that she's changing her perspective, you've become prematurely integrated and attached to the validation that you've received from her submitting herself to you, the feminine energy she was pouring in. So when she's ready to walk away, or she wants to stick around but she's not walking away, then now it's time for manipulation, right? And that's when you put your dominance ahead of your masculinity. When you put your masculinity ahead of your dominance, then if she isn't receptive to your dominance, then you pull back from your dominance. You have a logical conversation with the woman where you aren't trying to manipulate her, and then you just see what she's trying to do, right? And if you don't want to walk away from your masculinity or your dominance, the moment that the woman isn't picking up what you're putting down, you back away and you leave it alone, right? But masculinity and dominance are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. We have to stop conflating them. That's part of the reason why I made this sexual polarity quadrant, because a lot of people do that. Just like femininity and submissiveness aren't the same. I'm going to make that a separate video, right? I'm going to make that a separate video. But when we want to say masculine submissive, think about a woman who is having transactional sex with a man, right? Like, let's say she says, I will do this if you do this, right? That transactional mentality is the masculine submissive. Once you try to establish a masculine submissive rapport with someone, which is two people cooperating with one another based off of a transactional system and a reciprocal system where the power is equal based off of both people having the ability to walk away if they don't get what they want, but both people also having something they want from the other person that they don't currently have. Then once you take that and then you try to go over, like you're dishonest about what your agreement is, or you're breaking your agreement, breaking your arrangement, or you are lying to or manipulating or abusing the individual, then you are then exerting yourself from a standpoint of feminine dominance, right? That's what that is. That's what that is. It's feminine dominance. So let's say there is an implied understanding of what's going on, right? Like, let's say a woman is meeting a guy, right? And while meeting this guy, she knows he wants to have sex. She knows she never will, but then she commences to take advantage. She doesn't let him know that he's never going to fuck, but she wants to take advantage of the things that he wants to invest in her. So she will give the looming impression that it may occur, right? And that's what Alan Roger Curry would refer to as a manipulative time waster, right? That's a feminine dominant woman that, oftentimes is toxic femininity. So that is a woman who's feminine dominant, but a woman who says, this is what you want, this is what I want, give me what I want, I give you what you want. It's a fair exchange, no robbery and fair exchange. Boom, this masculine submissive on top of masculine submissive, right? Now, the thing to understand about different aspects of this, and this is where there's a caveat and a nuance within the sexual polarity quadrant, right? Like, let's say if a man is paying for sex and the woman is really the one who's in control of sex, then although she's taking a masculine submissive approach, she's still the primary giver of pleasure, right? So technically there's a little bit of dominance within that, but it could be as simple as a woman who just lays there, right? A woman who just lays there and gets fucked. The guy is doing the work to please himself, but he's pretty much using her body as a masturbatory toy, right? He's masturbating with her body. That's like the masculine submissive with the masculine submissive. You get what I'm saying? Like, that's how a lot of those things can work. And another reason why I believe that the sexual polarity quadrant is important is because a lot of people may believe that they are sexually incompatible due to not properly being within their sexual polarity within the quadrant, right? So like, let's say two people truly try to take a masculine submissive approach with one another, right? If no person takes the reins of being dominant, being the primary person in control and the primary giver of pleasure, right? And nobody decides to take that role of being the primary receiver of pleasure and the primary giver of control, then sometimes it can become a power struggle during sex where neither person wants to give up fully, right? Neither person fully wants to give up control to receive pleasure, but neither person truly wants to take control to give pleasure. And when two people are in that in-between space, it can often give two people the false impression that they are sexually incompatible when they really don't have to be. It's just, this is why the roles that you're in and what you choose to do and to understand and embrace your role is so important. This is also why it's so important to not have a negative connotation towards what it means to be feminine, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be dominant, or what it means to be submissive. Because if you take a role towards that, or take a mindset towards the idea of being feminine as bad, then you oftentimes won't give yourself the freedom to truly tap into that submissiveness when the opportunity presents itself, right? When you see being dominant is bad, then you'll never truly embrace taking control, unless oftentimes it may be coming from a bitter place, like let that hurt go dick, right? And when it comes from that bitter place, that may be the only time you act on it. So that means that the only time you have good sex is when you're having makeup sex, right? Or you're having breakup sex, or you're hate fucking, right? That's the only time where you really tap into your dominant energy, right? So oftentimes with dominance, a lot of men who are in the masculine submissive, what's on the flip side of that masculine submissive energy is a feminine dominant that's being repressed. That's called the shadow, right? So when you're in the masculine submissive, the shadow is looming. That's like if you are a masculine submissive individual and you have to go to your 9-to-5 job or your warehouse job, or you have to go work construction. You have to do this job that isn't very emotionally stimulating, mentally stimulating, or something that gives you a lot of purpose and fulfillment. And when you're in that job, it feels like you're betraying yourself on a regular basis. So when you leave off of work, or even when you go into work, you have to be high or drunk like every single day, right? And oftentimes there's something that can happen, right, for an individual who's in the masculine submissive position. And it's that feminine dominant is within that shadow, and because it's in the shadow, it's being repressed, that desire to be dominant. You have to kind of, sometimes you do things that could be damaging to yourself when you get off of work, and that's often what leads to a lot of addictions, right? And that's how a lot of affairs happen, right? It's like if you view your relationship more so as a duty than as a safe space, then that's work. When you're at work, you feel like you work, then you play, right? It's not purpose. You know, it's not about purpose, and it's not about being in the moment, right? It's not setting vision for purpose, right? Which would be more so the masculine dominant, a leader. And it's not also being someone who's in the feminine submissive, which is experiencing a high level of intrinsic desire, intrinsic reward, of fluidity to living in that moment, right? And that would be more representative of the feminine submissive, right? And for the masculine dominant, you have some feminine submissive that is inside of you. It's like the yin yang symbol, right? Where there's that little dot right there. And these things are things that get built up over time, right? It's like if you're in the masculine dominant position, while you're spending time with someone, your inclination is to reward good behavior. One of the greatest signs of a feminine dominant is to reward bad behavior, because you're attracted to the challenge. So the challenge that they're giving you by giving you stifled submissiveness it encourages something in you that makes you want to find a way to get them to give a greater level of control to you. So you get attracted to that. And sometimes that's just that cat and mouse game that you often see on TV and you see in movies and all this other shit, right? That's one aspect of it. But another aspect of it could go as far as an individual, like let's say that repressed submissiveness that comes with the masculine submissive. It could be a situation where a man gets turned, like a man who's kind of like got some fucked up mental health. He may see a woman who's playing quote unquote hard to get, which some women do. I'm not going to say that they don't, but he may take her resistance to him as playing hard to get, but having no intentions of actually following through with what she says she requires, right? And by trying to manipulate the woman, or some men may assault the woman, some men may lie to the woman and say he'll do whatever it takes, or say, oh yeah, I'm gonna make you my wife, all this other shit, or he may do a whole variety and plethora of things because he wants that particular outcome with that particular person more than anything else, right? And this is something that can happen when you're masculine dominant. If you start to prematurely integrate, or you don't allot for self-actualization within the feminine submissive party, then something that can happen is if when they decide that they want to self-actualize, or the core of their being is to be masculine and dominant as well, and where they want to change their growth is to go somewhere else, then something that can arise is you can go from the masculine dominant into the feminine dominant. Like if your anima isn't integrated, right? And a great example of this is Griffith with Guts within Berserk, where Griffith was very upfront about his intentions. He told people, I'm going to choose the place where you're going to die for me. He told Guts, I want you, Guts. I want you to join me, Guts, right? He was very upfront. He had a very logical plan that was set out. He was very disciplined in the way he did things, right? But because he repressed his anima, right? Because he had so much emotion that he repressed and didn't truly process, and also because he was so fixated on his goal that nothing else mattered, he didn't recognize that unconsciously he was emotionally attaching to Guts in a way to where the idea of Guts leaving, Guts inadvertently became part of his plan in the long run when he was in the masculine dominant stance. So when he was unexpectedly put in a position to lose one of the focal points and aspects of what he saw as his vision, it made him feel as he didn't like that, right? Because Griffith put his dominance ahead of his masculinity, right? So that meant that when Guts walked away, he felt emasculated. And this emasculation was presented within how Griffith's sword was broken in half by Guts' bigger sword. And I believe that in a lot of media, and especially within Berserk at times, that large sword is seen as somewhat of a symbol of masculine, of really dominance, right? It's a symbol of dominance within having this large sword. It's kind of like a phallic symbol, right? And having his little sword broken by this large thick chunk of iron was something that just completely broke his ego. He had a narcissistic injury, which damn near everybody gets. Don't say that shit's just narcissists. People who aren't narcissists get narcissistic injuries all the time. It's just called having your ego hurt, having your ego bruised. But the way he decided to recoup was to transmute that into the sexual energy and then to have a sexual conquest. But he lost sight of his purpose. He lost sight of the plan. He lost sight of the process that he was planning to go through. So he went to go have sex with Charlotte, right? And he went to go seduce Charlotte. You know, and when he went to go seduce Charlotte, he was able to reestablish a little level of power, but it wasn't the level of power that he wanted because it wasn't in the area where he was hurt. So he pretty much threw his entire life down the drain for a moment of dominance, right? And this can work in a variety of ways. This is something that happens all the time. It's like if you're out in the street and you and another man get into a fight and that man beats your ass, right? Instead of accepting that L, you go and get your gun and then you go back and shoot him, right? That is the feminine dominant, right? Because you put your desire for dominance over your masculinity when you're in a position where you're unable to be dominant in that environment. Because remember, the most common form and the most regular form of the sexual polarity quadrant is to be within the masculine submissive, right? But sometimes you can get attached to the dominance, and that's just how it is. And I'll say this as well, not every person who is in a masculine submissive position is someone who will end up in a position where they are, torn down, distraught, feeling like they're in a constant state of self-betrayal and going to do things that are detrimental to who they are and the lifestyle that they want to live. That's not always the case. Some people, they put a very strong emphasis on their masculinity and they build something called discipline. And where discipline is built, an individual can go from a masculine submissive position and work their way up to a position of dominance, going through the masculine submissive stance. And that's kind of like an individual who says, I'm going to go to school. They may not intrinsically desire and enjoy school, but their discipline, their lack of being emotionally overstimulated due to having a purpose or a passion may be something that gives them the ability to say, okay, cool, I'm going to go to this school. I know that this is going to give me some money, so I'm going to do what I got to do. So they put themselves in that position. They work, they go through that, and then they do it long enough, they discipline themselves, and then through that discipline, they reach a position of authority. They reach a position of power. And the position of power that they reach is one that often is going to have a certain level of stability. And it's like working your way up from a bus boy to the manager of the restaurant, to owning your own restaurant. That's taking the masculine submissive stance and using the discipline to push yourself forward, right? And sometimes what will happen is, let's say an individual has something that they are they're very feminine submissive towards. That can give them the motivation and the passion to develop the hard skills to push themselves and the discipline to push themselves to pursue the goal that they really want to pursue. It's just they're able to transmute that energy. So it's like, let's say someone says, listen, I have this goal, I have this video game I want to get, because I like to use playing video games as an expression of the feminine submissive. And remember that the feminine submissive is not a negative connotation, but investing in something so that you can do work, that's feminine submissive. You know what I mean? Investing in something so that you can have intrinsic desire and enjoyment from something that you're doing without actually receiving any like real financial benefits from it. That's more of a feminine submissive type of thing, right? I mean, that's what it is. So that's the feminine submissive. So let's say someone says, I really want this video game, but in order to get this video game, I have to work extra hours this week. That feminine submissive stance that they have towards that video game may be something that motivates them to work extra hard to do the things that they want. Another example of that could be, let's say somebody is an artist, right? They're an artist and they say, listen, I need to get this music equipment so that I can get this music done. But I'm not making enough money with the music yet, so I need to go to work, make this money, and after I make this money, then I can buy this equipment, and then it'll be a quicker course for me to get to this place where I could sustain myself off of what I'm doing with the feminine submissive, right? And what that can look like is in a variety of ways. That can look like you go to work and you work extra hard and you work extra hours and you discipline yourself because of the passion that you have for something else. That's like the outsourcing game, right? That's the outsourcing game. But I think that's enough about this right here. Masculinity and dominance are not one and the same. It's like the unstoppable force versus the immovable object.